The Lincoln Mark IV became an extremely popular luxury car in the mid-70s, and for the first time, Lincoln was really outselling Cadillac and its Eldorado, despite the fact that the Eldorado had both a coupe and a convertible, and the Mark IV was only offered in coupe form. Apparently, the $11,060 base price didn't scare too many customers away in 1976, as 56,000 customers bought these Continental Mark IVs. And by the way, that $11,060 base price is about the equivalent of $62,000, $63,000 base price today. And remember, that's base price before we start talking about things like the Bill Blass edition that you see here. Clearly, Lincoln was hitting its stride with the Continental Mark IV and its popularity, and this would be its ultimate year, as in 1977, Lincoln would switch to the redesigned Mark V, which, by the way, sold even better than the Mark IV. In 1977, the first year of the Mark V, it sold 80,000 units. I'm sure some of the folks at Cadillac were jealous because the Eldorado only sold about 50,000 units in 1976, and it had both the coupe and convertible form. And remember, this was the so-called last convertible, the last year of the convertible in 1976, when 14,000 were sold out of that total 50,000 for the entire Eldorado. Nonetheless, 1976 was a very special year for the Mark IV because you could get 4 different designer editions for your Mark IV, including the Bill Blass edition that you see here, a Pucci edition, a Cartier edition, and finally a Givenchy edition. It was a fitting tribute to the Mark IV, and really the designer editions, the designers whose names were put on those particular vehicles, didn't design the interiors. They really were just paid royalties to use their name. Lincoln had started different designer editions in 1973 on the Mark IV. That was the second year of the Mark IV. It was introduced in 1972, ran through 1976, but the 1972 Mark IV didn't have any so-called designer editions. In 1973, however, there was a silver designer edition that you can see here. The so-called silvery luxury group option gave you this beautiful exterior color and a cranberry cloth inside, which you can see in the typical Mark IV stitch pattern and the button tufting, which was the same as what was found in other Mark IVs. So you didn't get really different seats. But it was an overall tasteful package, and that was where the designer series started. As the years progressed, Ford would continue adding designer series to the Mark IV. It would have, as an example, a gold designer series in the next year. And eventually got to the point where these designer series were so popular that they decided to have 4 of them for 1976, as I mentioned. And that's where we come to this 1976 Bill Blass Mark IV. Now, 1976, as I mentioned, was the last year of the Mark IV. It also, by this point, is a bit of an unfortunate year. I think the best styled Mark IVs are those from the 1972 model year because you have the small bumpers on the front and rear. 1973, you have the big bumper on the front. You still have the small bumper rear. And that rear bumper is great because it's just so much more lithe and light-looking than this heavy, chunky rear bumper here on this 76 Bill Blass edition. Same for the front. It ruins the look of the car a little bit, but in any case, people love these designer editions, and I think they're still cool. And you see that the 76 Mark IV still has that Continental faux spare tire hump there on the trunk. That was started in the 1956 model year with the Continental Mark II and continued on every year the Continental was produced all the way through the Mark VIII. Out back, you'll notice that the Mark IV deviated from the Mark III and Mark II before it, in that the horizontal taillights were much different than the vertical theme used on the former 2 vehicles, and Lincoln would return to the vertical taillights in 1977 on the Mark V. Perhaps Lincoln just wanted a different look than what Cadillac had staked a claim to with the vertical taillights. And these look tasteful, but I do think that the Mark V, as well as the 3 and 2 rears, are more distinctive than this particular Mark IV. Turning to the side profile of the vehicle, you'll notice that this 76 Mark IV has a full-length body side molding there that's in the accent color. This is not just some rubber body side molding, but if you look up close, it actually has quite a bit of detail in it. You can see up close, it kind of has this filigree design to it, and rumor has it that a designer in the Ford studio went down to a hardware store one day to get some molding for his house, and he saw a molding that looked like this and liked it so much that he decided to put it on the car. And while that's a rumor, I actually believe it's kind of true because this molding is pretty thick and does resemble something you'd see in a hardware store. Returning back to the side profile, you'll notice that this car has some beautiful aluminum wheels, and they have this big, chunky center lug nut design. There's two different stories as to how that design came about. One is that it was inspired by Formula racing, where you had the one lug nut holding on the entire wheel. And the other is that it was inspired by some of the classic vehicles of the 1920s, like Rolls Royces, that also had a single lug nut. Not quite sure which is true, but those are some of the explanations I've heard given for the inspiration on this particular vehicle. You also notice on this Mark IV that it has flush door handles. Now, for whatever reason, Ford introduced these flush door handles in 1971 on its full-size lineup, but by 1973, they had transitioned to non-flush door handles, or handles that actually stood proud of the body. But the Mark IV kept these throughout its entire lifespan into 1976. We also, of course, have the trademark so-called opera window in the back, or the C-pillar on these Mark IVs. That opera window was an option in the 1972 model year. You didn't have to get it in that particular year and that particular year alone. By 1973, it was mandatory content on these Mark IVs. But I think one of the best-looking Mark IVs is one without the opera window. And again, that was only offered in 1972. They're extremely rare, as only about 15-ish% of the Mark IVs don't have opera windows in 1972. And frankly, you kind of need them because that C-pillar is so chunky that it's hard to see out of the back without it. And remember, these cars didn't come standard in 1972 with the passenger side outside rear view mirror. By 1976, they did, but not for 1972. So it was really hard to actually see on that side of the vehicle. And interestingly, on the 1972 Mark IVs without the opera window, the rear window doesn't retract all the way. Doesn't retract all the way when you have the opera window. It only retracts about 1.5 inches or 2 inches. But even when you don't have the opera window, it still doesn't retract all the way. And by 1976, Ford had costed out the power window motors in the back. So these windows in the back are actually fixed, which is fine. That was true for a number of Fords during the era. Ford would cost out the rear power window motors as well, and the Mercury Marquis as an example too. And one last exterior element is this little rubber flap behind the fuel filler door. You can see this says unleaded gasoline only. I think most people just cut this off or removed it, but this is how they came from the factory to remind you that you were not to use leaded gasoline on this vehicle because it had a catalytic converter. And a little bit annoying, but effective. You certainly were reminded every time that you filled up that you were not to put leaded fuel in this particular vehicle. And now we really get to the heart of the beast, the interior of this Bill Blass Mark IV. Again, by this point, Ford had already come up with this seat pattern with those 4 biscuits on the bottom bolster as well as the top of the seat. That was introduced in 1974 on the gold luxury trim. And for some of these designer editions, all Ford really did was change the color scheme and slap a designer label on it. And that's what they did here for Bill Blass. I don't know why Bill Blass got the blue and kind of cream-colored accent stripe interior as well as exterior package, but that was what his name was associated with. So that was the big differentiator on this Bill Blass edition. You'll notice the instrument panel, which was redesigned for the Mark IV in 1972, is still the same here with the faux wood grain that I think looks very unconvincing. And that's a shame because the faux wood grain in the Mark III, the 69 Mark III more specifically, looks actually very convincing. In 1970 and 71, the Mark III would have real wood on the interior. And you can see here the instrument panel where it says unleaded fuel only there in the middle of the fuel gauge. That was added in 1975 as the catalytic converter was added. The Mark IVs do have a Cartier clock that was introduced on the Mark III. Partway through the 1969 model year, the early 69s do not have a Cartier clock. And you have this very square-formed overall instrument panel that, like I said, I'm not overly a fan of, but it's okay. The little chiclets at the top are for the left and right turn signal, as well as the bright light indicator. Over on the driver's door panel, you'll notice that there are only 2 window switches there. As I mentioned, the rear windows by this point had been made fixed. There is a window lock switch that would lock out the passenger side window. You didn't want your passenger to be able to operate it. And then beneath that is the door lock switch. You also see that this has the infamous power seat controls. And this is something that is troubling a lot of these Mark IVs and Lincolns of the era, is that these seat switches are now starting to catch on fire if they're corroded. So make sure that you take your armrest apart here and clean the contacts on those switches and make sure that it's not corroded. If it is, get a replacement off of eBay or somewhere else. My switch contacts are not corroded, but just for safekeeping, whenever I have my Mark IV stored for extended periods of time, I just disconnect the battery. That way that seat switch isn't hot. It's hot all the time, whether or not the key is on or off. So just disconnect the battery for safekeeping on these, and that's the best thing that you can do, I would say. Now here's a view from the passenger side of the interior, and you'll notice that there's a plaque on the dash. That was standard on the Bill Blass edition. You could get it engraved with your name if you so desired. And also take a look at the glove box in these Mark IVs. I think it's the smallest glove box that I've ever seen in a car. It's this rinky-dink little glove box. I don't know why they couldn't fit anything more, but that is just absolutely diminutive from a storage space perspective on these vehicles. Here's a better close-up of that glove box door, which in this case is ill-fitting, as well as the plaque. And like I said, you can see that the glove box is extremely small in these Mark IVs, and that door is way too flimsy for a luxury car as well. Another strange cost-cutting features on these 1976 Mark IVs is that they deleted the inside passenger mirror, which was present on the Mark IV when it was introduced. And again, this is a top trim line, so I'm not quite sure why they would do that. I guess they felt that it wasn't necessary, but kind of a shame if you wanted to look at yourself and you were sitting in the passenger seat. Next, let's take a look at the climate control over on the driver's side of the instrument panel. And by the way, you can see here the two faux wood grains, this pecan wood as well as faux burl, and that burl just looks terrible, especially when it's cracking here, as you can see at the bottom. But by 1976, Ford had redesigned the climate control panel. You'll notice there's now an economy setting. That didn't exist when the Mark IV was introduced. You would just have a low and a high auto speed setting. So there's now an economy setting and an auto, and the fan speeds are controlled by a separate control there at the bottom. You can see low, high, and then max. You put the switch into the max setting, the fan would blow on full blast. Low and high didn't just mean that you only had two speeds of blower, but if you put the switch in the low setting, it would just have, I think, 4 or 5 blower speeds, and it would have the air circulate at a lower speed than if you had it set in high mode. And here we have the back seat of this Bill Blass Mark IV, which is a pretty cramped area. This car, despite being 224 inches long, does not have much space in the back seat. It's all about the hood and the trunk room, and the car just has super long overhangs. It's only a 120-inch wheelbase, but 224 inches long. By the way, Alanis Morissette sang her song Ironic in the back seat of not a Mark IV, but a Mark V, but it's basically the same back seat and similarly cramped. Turning under hood, this Mark IV is powered by a 460 cubic inch V8 that was making in the low 200s horsepower, I think 208 horsepower. Not great for the time, plenty of torque though. And for those Ford fans out there, I hate to break it to you, but take a look at the power steering pump and the air conditioning compressor. These are General Motors parts. Ooh, GM A6 AC compressor made by Frigidaire. Actually, the air conditioning system, this Mark IV was made by Harrison, GM's air conditioning division or HVAC division at the time. And this was the first Ford to use that GM compressor in 1972. It would later proliferate across some of the Ford lineup, in part because the 2-piston York compressor just wasn't enough to cool the cabin on these days. That HVAC system just didn't have the capacity to cool the cabin that these GM A6 compressors did. You'll also notice that by this point, Ford has transitioned to the hydro boost. There's no vacuum booster. I suppose it's because all the vacuum lines and how much had to run off of vacuum in these Mark IVs. So they went to the hydro boost system just like GM did for the Eldorado. And you can also see the ignition module. That's that silver box there on the driver's side fender. And lastly, we'll take a look at the humorously small trunk on these Mark IVs. I know it looks big in this picture, but trust me, it's not. That full-size spare takes up an immense amount of room. The trunk is pretty shallow. Yes, you can fit a golf bag or maybe 2 in there, but that's about it. This trunk only has about 14 cubic feet. The Mark V would get a much larger trunk. And part of the reason for the issue here is that the fuel tank is now underneath the trunk floor, whereas in the Mark III, the trunk is much bigger because the fuel tank is mounted vertically, just like it was in the full-size Fords. But Ford had the fuel tank underneath the trunk pan in these vehicles, similar to the Torino, upon which a fair amount of the engineering in the Mark IV is based. And as a consequence, you just don't have a great trunk in these. And that's it. I hope you enjoyed this special on the 1976 Mark IV Bill Blass edition, one of the last of the Mark IVs, and kind of tacky with the blue and cream Bill Blass color scheme, but yeah, still kind of cool. These cars are extremely comfortable drivers, very, very, very softly sprung, waterbed-like ride. If you don't want that and you're looking for something that's a good handler, do not buy one of these cars. That is not what they are. If you want something that's ultra cushy and plush and quiet, then this is the vehicle for you, and maybe you can find a Bill Blass edition for yourself. Thanks again for watching. Until next time, take care, and let me know if you liked this feature. Put a comment in the comment section.